You have your camera out before you have even properly stopped walking. Everyone does. It is one of those reflexes that London installs in visitors within the first 48 hours. The reaching for the phone, the framing of the shot, the mild competitive instinct to get the angle that the person next to you has not thought of yet. And the subject in front of you is, by any measure, worth the effort. The forecourt of Buckingham Palace on a clear morning is one of those views that the word iconic was invented for and subsequently worn down to meaninglessness by overuse. The gates, the stone, the flag if you are lucky and paying attention to which flag, and the guards. The guards especially. There is always a small crowd arranged in a loose semicircle near the sentry boxes, phones raised, watching the figures in the tall bearskin hats stand in a stillness so complete it looks less like discipline and more like suspension. Like someone pressed pause on a human being and forgot to come back. Children test the limits of this stillness in the way children always do, edging closer than they are supposed to, waiting for a blink, a twitch, a sign that what they are looking at is actually alive. The guards give them nothing. They are very good at giving nothing. And this is where the assumption settles in, comfortable and completely wrong. You assume, because the assumption is almost irresistible, that what you are looking at is performance. Ceremonial theater staged for your benefit and the benefit of the 40 other tourists arranged around you, and the several million people who will do exactly this in the coming year. You assume that the stillness is the point, that the not moving, the not blinking, the magnificent impassive refusal to acknowledge the child now approximately 18 inches from the sentry box, that this is what these men are here to do. You take your photograph, you move on, and you never find out that the man you just photographed was, at the moment you press the shutter, doing something that had nothing to do with being looked at. He was reading the building behind him. Not metaphorically, not in any poetic or abstract sense, reading it the way a ship's navigator reads water, for information, for confirmation, for the specific signals that told him something the official notification system had not yet gotten around to confirming. He was reading the lights. He was listening, in the way that long familiarity makes possible across distances that should make listening impossible for the dogs. And from these two things, from the particular combination of illuminated windows on the upper floors and the specific quality of interior, sound that 4 corgis in motion produce in a building of that size and that particular acoustic character, he already knew. The Queen was home. This is the story of how he knew, of why he knew before anyone told him, of the unwritten, unrecorded, never officially acknowledged system of reading that the men who stood outside Buckingham Palace developed over decades of standing outside Buckingham Palace. And it is the story of James Perkins, Grenadier Guards, 22 years of service, 11 of them on palace duty, who was perhaps the finest reader of that building that the regiment ever quietly, completely accidentally produced. He would not use the word finest. He would not use any word because nobody ever asked him. That is also part of this story. James Perkins was not the kind of soldier who collected attention. This is not a criticism. In an institution like the Grenadier Guards, the collection of personal attention is not generally considered a virtue. The regiment has been in continuous existence since 1656. It has fought at Waterloo. It has stood at the funerals of monarchs. It has, across nearly 4 centuries of service, developed a finely calibrated sense of what matters and what does not. And personal prominence, in the Guards' particular value system, falls firmly in the category of what does not. Perkins understood this instinctively. He had grown up in Derbyshire, the second son of a man who worked for the same engineering firm for 31 years without ever being promoted, and who seemed, when his son later thought about it, entirely at peace with this. There was a quality in the long, unspectacular faithfulness to a thing that Perkins recognized in himself early and that drew him, without drama or declared ambition, toward military service at the age of 18. He was not the most decorated soldier in his regiment. He was not the fastest, not the most physically imposing, not the one the younger guardsman gravitated toward for inspiration in the visible, articulable way that certain soldiers inspire. What he was, and what the people who worked alongside him came to understand only gradually, over the accumulation of shared duties and small professional observations, was this: he was the most attentive. Not attentive in the anxious, vigilant, eyes-always-moving sense that suggests a nervous system running slightly too hot for comfort. Attentive in the deeper sense. The sense of a person who had decided, at some point so early in his professional life that he could no longer locate exactly when, that the world repaid close looking. That things revealed themselves to people who were willing to stay still and wait and notice, and that this was not a passive activity, but in fact, the most active thing a person could choose to do. He arrived at palace duty at 31, transferred from public duties in Windsor, and he spent the first 3 months at Buckingham Palace doing what any sensible professional does when they arrive somewhere new and complex. He watched. He listened. He asked very few questions because the questions he had were not the kind that had clean answers, and he had learned early that clean answer questions were not usually the interesting ones. The interesting question, the one that he did not ask aloud but that organized his attention for those first 3 months, and for the 11 years that followed, was simple. What does this building tell you, if you are standing outside it, about what is happening inside it? The answer, it turned out, was considerable. Start with what everyone knows, or thinks they know. The royal standard, the flag flown from the palace flagpole, is the official public signal of the sovereign's presence. When the Queen is in residence at Buckingham Palace, the standard flies. When she is not, it does not. This is public knowledge. This is the thing the guidebooks mention. This is what the tourists check when they arrive, craning upward, trying to remember which flag means what. And it is useful information, accurate information. It is also, in the world that James Perkins inhabited, approximately the last thing you needed to check, because by the time the flag confirmed what you wanted to know, you had already known it for somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours. The lights were faster. Not the lights in the grand ceremonial rooms at the front of the building. Those followed their own logic, their own maintenance schedules, their own patterns that had more to do with event preparation and housekeeping rotation than with the presence or absence of any particular person. The lights that mattered were on the upper floors, the private floors, the rooms that the public does not see, and that do not appear in the official photographs, and that most people, looking up at the facade of the palace from the forecourt, would not be able to identify or locate with any precision. Perkins could locate them. He had mapped them, not on paper, never on paper, but in the accumulated memory of 11 years of standing in front of that building at every hour of the day and night, in every season, in every weather condition that London produces, which covers a considerable range. He knew which windows belonged to which rooms the way a person knows the layout of a house they have lived in for a decade, not by consulting a plan, but by the body's own interior geography. And he knew what the light in those windows meant. When Her Majesty was in residence, certain rooms came alive in a sequence that was not random and not variable. The pattern had a logic to it, the logic of a person moving through their private space in the way they had always moved through it, following routines so deeply established that they had long since ceased to be decisions and had become simply the shape of the day. A light in a particular sitting room by early evening. A specific combination of illumination on the corridor that connected the private apartments to the working rooms. The warm, distinctly different quality of light from a room with its curtains partially drawn against the evening, as opposed to a room being used by staff for preparation or cleaning. These were not dramatic signals. They were not designed to be read. They were simply the byproduct of a person living in a building, of a life being lived on the other side of the stone and the glass. And they were legible, if you had spent enough time watching, with a precision that would have surprised the people producing them. Perkins did not talk about this openly, even among the duty guards who worked alongside him. Not because it was secret exactly, but because it was not the kind of thing that translated well into casual conversation. How do you explain to someone that you can read the difference between a palace that is occupied and a palace that is maintained? How do you describe the specific quality of aliveness that a building acquires when the person at its center is present, without sounding like you have drifted into something mystical or strange? You do not explain it. You simply know it. And over time, the people around you begin to notice that you know it, without being entirely sure how, and this becomes one of those professional reputations that circulates not through announcement, but through the quiet accumulation of small, observed accuracies. He was right about the lights. He was right consistently, over years, with a reliability that the duty roster confirmed retroactively every time. The times he had quietly, without making anything of it, mentioned to the duty sergeant that he believed Her Majesty had returned, and the times this had subsequently proved correct. But the lights were only half of it. There is a version of this story that could be told entirely through the lights, and it would be a complete story, accurate and interesting and sufficient. But it would be missing the element that the men who worked with Perkins considered the more remarkable half, partly because it was stranger, partly because it required a quality of attention that went beyond observation into something closer to genuine fluency. The corgis. Her Majesty's corgis were not, in any official or formal sense, part of the security or operational landscape of Buckingham Palace. They were dogs, beloved, famous, closely associated with their owner in the public imagination to the point where the breed itself had become shorthand for a certain kind of Britishness, but dogs nonetheless. They had no protocol role. They appeared in no procedural document. No training manual for palace duty guards contained any reference to them whatsoever. And yet, a building the size of Buckingham Palace, 775 rooms, a facade stretching 108 meters across the front alone, stone walls of considerable thickness, the whole structure sitting on its own grounds behind its own gates in the middle of one of the loudest cities in the world, is not, in the ordinary way of things, a building through which sound travels easily to the people standing outside it. But sound does travel, in specific conditions, at specific times of day, through specific architectural channels that Perkins had identified through years of standing in front of the building at hours when the city around it was quiet enough to hear what the building was saying. In the early mornings, particularly in winter when the tourist crowds had not yet assembled, and the traffic on the Mall had not yet reached its daytime volume, the forecourt of Buckingham Palace was quieter than most people who had only seen it in daylight would believe possible. And in that quiet, if you were standing in the right position and you were the kind of person whose attention had been trained over years toward this specific building and its specific acoustic personality, you could hear, not clearly, not in the way you hear something close, but as a quality, a texture of sound at the edge of perception, the interior life of the place. The corgis produced a sound in the palace that was unlike the sound produced by any other element of its operation. Not barking, or not primarily barking. Dogs in a large building with stone floors and long corridors produce in motion a particular percussion, nails on stone, the soft concussive sound of small bodies moving with the particular low center of gravity urgency that corgis in motion characteristically display. And beneath both of these, the specific acoustic shadow of small animals in a large space that is, at some level, responding to the presence of a person they know and are oriented toward. Perkins described it once to a younger guardsman who had asked him directly how he always seemed to know, as the sound of the building being happy. He said it without sentiment, in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting a professional observation, and the younger guardsman did not know what to do with it, and the conversation moved on. But the description was precise. It was not poetry. It was an accurate account of a specific, identifiable acoustic phenomenon that, in combination with the light signals from the upper floors, produced in Perkins a level of certainty about the Queen's presence that the flag, when it subsequently appeared, merely confirmed. The dogs knew she was home before the household did, in the way that dogs know things before households do, through the particular alert orientation of an animal whose entire interior world is organized around a single person, and whose behavior in that person's presence is fundamentally, detectably different from their behavior in that person's absence. Perkins knew she was home because the dogs knew she was home, and the dogs told the building, and the building, if you were standing in front of it and you had spent 11 years learning how to listen, told him. Here is what most people assume about ceremonial military duty at a royal palace, and here is why that assumption, while not entirely wrong, misses the thing that matters most. The assumption is this: the guards are symbolic. Their presence is meaningful in the way that all symbols are meaningful, as a statement, a tradition, a visual confirmation of something the institution wants to communicate about itself. The bearskins, the scarlet tunics, the precision of the drill, the magnificent immobility in front of the tourist cameras, all of this is, in the public imagination, located firmly in the category of pageantry. Of Britain doing what Britain does, which is to take the past and maintain it in the present with a dedication that other cultures find either admirable or faintly eccentric, depending on their own relationship with history. And there is truth in this. The ceremonial function is real. It matters. The continuity it represents, the unbroken line of uniformed presence at the palace going back centuries, carries a weight that is not reducible to decoration, as the previous story in this account of British military traditions tried to show with different material. But the guards are not only symbolic, they are not primarily symbolic. They are, underneath the ceremony and before the ceremony and in the practical daily reality of their duty, a security and awareness function. They are people who are supposed to know what is happening in and around the building they are guarding. They are supposed to know who is present, who is expected, what the status of the building is at any given moment. The ceremony is the visible surface of something that is, at its core, entirely operational. And this is where the light reading and the dog listening become not curiosities, but professional competencies of genuine consequence. When Her Majesty was in residence, the operational reality of palace duty changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be visible to anyone standing on the pavement outside the gates, but in the way that an alert level changes, a tightening of attention, a sharpening of the observation that the duty guards maintained, a slight but real recalibration of what counted as normal and what counted as requiring response. The standard had not yet appeared. The household had not yet circulated the confirmation. The official notification system, which existed, which functioned, which was entirely adequate for most purposes, had simply not yet caught up with what James Perkins had already confirmed through the lights and the sound of 4 small dogs on stone floors. And in that gap, that window of 40 minutes to 2 hours between what the building was telling him and what the official system had gotten around to confirming, Perkins was already operating at the higher level of alertness, already reading the forecourt traffic differently, already noting the change in staff movement at the side entrances, the particular quality of preparedness that a working royal household exhibits when its central person is present rather than absent. This is not a dramatic thing. It produced no incidents, resolved no crises, did not figure in any official record or commendation. It was simply competence, operating quietly at the edge of what the institution formally required, and in the space where the institution's formal requirements ran out and individual expertise began. But consider what you are looking at when you look at this. Consider what the ability to read a building, to know, from light patterns and ambient sound and the behavior of 4 dogs inside stone walls, who is home, actually represents. You are looking at 11 years of attention, 11 years of showing up, day after day, in all weather, at all hours, and deciding consistently that the building in front of you was worth watching closely. You are looking at the decision, made so early that it stopped being a decision and became simply a professional habit, that nothing about this place was incidental, that every signal it produced was worth noting. That the gap between what the system told you and what the building was telling you, if you were paying the right kind of attention, was not a gap to be ignored, but a source of information that a good guardsman could not afford to waste. The ceremony is the memory, as the previous story said. The function is still underneath it. James Perkins found the function underneath the ceremony and used it every day, without comment, without record, without anyone on the other side of the gates ever knowing that the still figure in the bearskin hat was reading their home with an accuracy that the official systems could not match. Not everyone who stood duty at Buckingham Palace developed this fluency. It would be wrong to suggest that Perkins was doing something that any sufficiently attentive guardsman would naturally arrive at, because the evidence of the duty rosters and the recollections of the men who served alongside him does not support that conclusion. There were guards who did their duty correctly, professionally, without complaint and without incident, for years, and who never developed anything like the building reading capacity that Perkins had. They checked the flag when they wanted to know if the Queen was in residence. They received the official notifications when they came, and they acted on them when they arrived, and they did their job well by every measurable standard the regiment applied. There were others who tried to read the building and got it wrong often enough that the attempt became, quietly, a source of professional embarrassment. A guardsman who announces his conclusions about the building's occupancy status and is wrong with any regularity is a guardsman who has mistaken confidence for competence, which is a different thing entirely and considerably less useful. Perkins was right. This is the fact that distinguished him, and it is a fact that resists simple explanation. Some part of it was the quality of attention he brought. Some part of it was the 11 years, the accumulated hours, the depth of familiarity with a single building that most people never develop with any place in their lives. Some part of it was something harder to name, a patience, a willingness to sit with uncertain information and not resolve it prematurely into confidence, that allowed him to wait until the signals were clear before he acted on what they were telling him. The younger guardsmen learned to watch him. Not obviously, not in a way that he would have noticed or would have welcomed if he had noticed, because that kind of informal mentorship through observation was itself a guard's tradition. You did not ask to be taught. You simply paid attention to the people doing the job well, and you took what you could from watching them. They noticed when he changed, almost imperceptibly, the quality of his attention. When something in the stillness that was always his professional manner became a different kind of stillness, more directed, more oriented, the stillness of a person receiving information rather than simply maintaining position. They learned in time that this shift meant something specific, that when Perkins went from still to that other stillness, it was worth paying slightly more attention yourself, because something in the building was probably worth noting. He never pointed it out. He never said, "Look, the third window on the left has come on, which means the sitting room is occupied, which means she is likely back from Sandringham or Balmoral or wherever the schedule had taken her." He simply knew, and he proceeded accordingly, and the people around him, if they were watching closely enough, could see the knowledge in the small adjustments he made to how he held his attention. There was one night. This story circulates among people who served at the palace during the relevant period, without the kind of documentation that would make it confirmable in any official sense, but with the consistency of detail that suggests it is grounded in something real, when the notification came through unusually late. A return that had been scheduled for the following morning had been moved forward, quietly, for reasons that had to do with the weather at the point of departure, and the preference always of the household for not making changes public until they were settled. The official confirmation reached the duty sergeant at 11:40 in the evening. The flag would go up in the morning. Perkins had adjusted his attention at approximately 9:15. No one asked him about this directly. The duty sergeant, who had served long enough to know what he was looking at, noted it in his own private memory and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Perkins had not done anything unusual. He had not communicated any finding through the proper channels, because there was no proper channel for the kind of finding he had made and no official language for expressing it. He had simply, as he always did, read what the building was telling him and responded accordingly. This is the kind of competence that institutions run on and rarely acknowledge and almost never record. The unwritten knowledge, the expertise that lives in a person rather than in a document, that cannot be transferred through training because it is not, in any formal sense, training that produces it. It is produced by years and years of attentive presence, by the decision to take seriously the information that the official systems overlook, by the particular professional seriousness of a person who has decided that their job is worth doing with the full weight of their attention, whether or not anyone is watching. Which, in the specific and somewhat wonderful irony of Perkins' situation, almost no one ever was. He retired from the Grenadier Guards at 53. There was a regimental dinner. There were handshakes. There was, from the people who had served alongside him and knew what they were thanking him for, a warmth that exceeded the formal occasion, though it was expressed, as warmth tends to be expressed in that particular professional culture, with considerable understatement. Someone said he had been a very steady man. This was not faint praise. In the Guards, steady is a significant word. It means what it says and more than it says, and the people in the room knew both things. Perkins went back to Derbyshire. He walks now. He has a dog, not a corgi, and he walks it in the mornings in a landscape that is as different from the forecourt of Buckingham Palace as landscape can be while remaining in the same country. Hills and stone walls and a quiet that is entirely different from the pre-dawn quiet of the Mall, which is a city quiet, an absence of noise that is normally present quiet, whereas this is simply the natural condition of where he is. He does not talk about the palace much, not because it was unimportant, but because the people around him would not have the context to understand what he was describing, and he has never been a man who enjoyed explaining himself, and because the thing itself, the lights, the dogs, the building that spoke to him every morning for 11 years, is complete in his memory and does not require an audience to remain what it was. Here is what you now know that you did not know when you began. You know that the guard in front of Buckingham Palace is not performing stillness. He is, if he is very good at his job and has stood in front of that building long enough, performing an act of active reception, taking in information from the building behind him, and from the grounds around him, and from the ambient signals of a working royal household that the official systems have not yet gotten around to processing. You know that the lights on the upper floors of the palace, the private floors, the floors that no guidebook mentions and no tourist photograph captures, carry information about the presence or absence of the person at the building's center. Information that is legible, with sufficient familiarity, before the flag appears and before the notification comes. You know that 4 corgis in a stone building produce a sound that is different from the sound of 4 corgis in an empty building, and that this difference, at the edge of audibility, in the early morning quiet of a forecourt that the city has not yet filled, was for 11 years a reliable signal to one particular guardsman that his professional attention needed to adjust. You know that James Perkins never wrote any of this down, that no training manual contains his name or his methods, that the expertise he built over 11 years of attentive duty existed entirely inside him and was transferred, imperfectly and incompletely, only through the informal channel of younger guardsmen watching him and trying to understand what they were seeing. You know that the gap between what the official system told him and what the building was telling him was not a gap that the institution ever formally closed, because the institution did not know it existed, because the person who had found it and was using it daily did not think of it as a discovery, but simply as his job, done properly, which meant done with full attention regardless of whether full attention was formally required. And you know that when he retired, the knowledge retired with him. The current guards at Buckingham Palace are professionals doing their duty with the seriousness and precision the regiment demands. Some of them, the ones who have stood there long enough and brought the right quality of attention, will be developing their own version of this fluency, their own reading of the building, their own set of signals that the system overlooks and that personal experience has taught them to trust. This is how unwritten knowledge perpetuates itself in institutions that last long enough for it to develop. Not through documentation, not through formal transfer, but through the slow accumulation of individual attention, repeated over years in front of the same building, until the building begins to speak. Do you think most people who stop on the pavement outside the palace gates understand any of this? Do you think the tourist arranging their children for the photograph, the commuter cutting through the park, the journalist writing the color piece about the changing of the guard, do they know that the still figure in the bearskin hat might be, at the moment they are looking at him, doing something that the official systems around him cannot do? Most of them do not. And this is not a criticism. It is simply what happens when competence becomes invisible through long practice, when a skill is so thoroughly absorbed into the professional self that it produces no visible signs of effort, no markers that would alert an observer to the fact that something is happening at all. The Grenadier Guards do not issue a press release when one of their guardsmen learns to read a building. They do not give medals for the kind of expertise that operates in the gap between what the system knows and what the person knows. They simply post the duty roster, and the man goes to the post, and the building tells him what it tells him, and he acts accordingly, and the institution functions at a level of quiet, unacknowledged excellence that it could not achieve through procedure alone. There is something in this that is worth sitting with. The entire visible apparatus of royal ceremonial, the uniforms, the precision, the magnificent public performance of an institution that has been doing this for centuries rests, in part, on the invisible competence of individuals who are standing in front of it and have decided, without being asked to make this decision, that close attention is a professional obligation rather than an optional extra. The ceremony is what you see. The attention is what makes the ceremony safe. And the man who was best at the attention was standing in front of the most photographed building in Britain, being photographed by tourists who saw a still figure in a uniform for 11 years, without anyone on either side of the lens ever quite understanding what they were looking at. The lights on the upper floors, the sound of 4 small dogs on stone, a building learning over the course of a career to speak to a man who had decided it was worth listening to. That is not decoration. It is not ceremony, or not only ceremony. It is what happens when a person takes a job seriously enough, for long enough, that the job begins to expand beyond its formal boundaries into something that has no name and no record and no official recognition. James Perkins knew the Queen was home. He knew it from the lights. He knew it from the dogs. He knew it the way you know things that you have earned the right to know through years of quiet, uncelebrated, fully committed attention. And then he walked back to Derbyshire, and the knowing went with him, and the palace stands as it has always stood, being read every morning by whoever is standing in front of it and paying the right kind of attention. Gray on the left, black on the right in the previous story. Lights on the upper floor, dogs in the corridor in this one. Different signals, the same principle. The things worth knowing about an institution are almost never the things it tells you. They are the things it shows you, quietly, every day, to the people who have decided that looking closely is part of the job.